Hello and welcome to the podcast According to Sci-Faith, where we discuss topics revolving around the compatibility of science and faith. I'm Joshua Göcking and you're listening to According to Sci-Faith. Episode 33, The Scientific Method. If you're a regular listener to this podcast, then you maybe have heard me several times talking about the scientific method and its importance. And also I was regularly trying to distinguish ancient science like the Greeks, the ancient Greeks did it, from modern science by establishing that this scientific method was basically the difference which made this change, which led to the scientific revolution, which led to these huge changes, which we also will be talking about later. But in this episode, I want to talk about the scientific method in general. What is it? Why do we need it? Why is it so successful? And more than that, I want to look into how the scientific method came about, how we came to this methodology that has been proven to be so successful. So the scientific method is, there are different founders you can call for this, that established this theory. It was something that was established organically. Some traces of the scientific method you can already find with the ancient Greeks, but for the most part, it really was established later during the Renaissance period, during Newton, and so on, during modernity, which is also why it is often called modern science, and which is why only then the thing we today call the scientific revolution was unleashed. And one of the people who were most behind this was one of the founder, basically the person who can be considered the founder of the scientific method, if there is such a person, would be Isaac Newton. And let's first look into what the scientific method is. And basically, when we talk about science, the word science basically means knowledge. But what kind of knowledge, you might ask? There are different kinds of knowledge you can have. You can say, I have knowledge like an intuition. You can say, I dreamed something, and I think this dream is more than just a dream. It is a revealed reality or something. Then you can also say this is some kind of knowledge that you got in this way. Or in religions, there you have revelation knowledge, you call it, knowledge that was obtained by revelation. And in science, usually you do not, or when we talk today about science, we usually do not mean this kind of knowledge. We need knowledge that we gather from nature, and not only knowledge that we in some sense gather from nature, but by a specific methodology, and this is the scientific method. And for this, if you consider, for example, how the ancient Greeks did science, they tried to deduce in their mind how they think from first principles, from principles they believe to be true, how the world should be. And with this, they achieved some success. Some theories of them proved to be true, but some turned out to be wrong, like the Ptolemaic worldview, which considered the Earth to be in the center of the solar system, and so on. So some turned out to be false, and this was not found out because the thinking of them was, if I have deduced something perfectly without any error in my mind, then it has to be true apparently. Then I do not need to make an experiment or something like this and check whether it's actually true. It just is true because I did nothing wrong. I deduced it perfectly. However, that might be even true, but if one does not deduce it perfectly, of course, then it will lead to mistakes which will not be catched because you don't make an experiment to check whether your theory or what you deduced is correct. So what in the modern science came about was more focused on this experimental part, to say, okay, what we observe in science, we need to really observe it, we need to really check it, we need to falsify it. And here you have this sentence, word falsify, from false on instead of verifying it in the sense of being true. So what we actually not only want is to check whether the predictions, our theories do are actually true. That's not the only part we want to do. We want to also say that our theories have to exclude things, have to say things would be not fulfilled if this theory were true. And if we then can check that this is then we can use this to try to falsify this theory, to try to prove that it is false. And if we cannot manage to do so, then it's a pretty high indicator that the theory is indeed true, because we couldn't claim otherwise. So it's a kind of even more strict way than just to say, okay, if your theory predicts something and we can see it in nature, then it is true, and then we will accept it, because then you could do a lot of cheating and basically create theories that can basically explain every phenomenon. And if there is if it exists in nature, you can say, yeah, my theory is true, wonderful. And if it doesn't exist, yeah, well, then you since you do not falsify it, since you do not have this mechanism, you basically lose nothing, and you can say your theory is true. But you will see that if you think about it, that this is not a really helpful theory, because then anything goes, anything can be explained. And in this way, if you can explain anything, then actually you are explaining nothing. So such theories do not hold any value, and therefore it is important to not only verify theories, but even more than that, to be able to falsify theories. This is really important in science, and that's why we are talking about theories being falsifiable and not only verifiable. So this is one crucial aspect of the scientific method. There are some other aspects that also are important. For example, it needs a theory, or the results of a theory need to be reproducible. So if I measure something to falsify a theory, then this needs to be reproducible. I need to be able to make this experiment several times, and all the time I need to achieve the same result, falsifying or verifying this theory. And also there is also this condition that it needs to be intersubjective. What is meant by that is that should not depend on the person or the state of the person who does the experiment. It should be interchangeable. It doesn't matter who or where he does it. It should be the same everywhere. So this is also one condition, but those are weaker conditions, and also in a sense not always applicable, because there are also branches of science, or what one would consider, at least in some sense, science, where this is not possible. For example, already in physics, if you look into physics, if you look into the Big Bang Theory, there we are dealing with something that has happened. Something that has happened and will not likely happen again, at least not for us to observe it, and therefore we cannot say we reproduce it, we cannot have it again to measure it again and again and again, because it only happened once and it is in the distant past and we weren't there to observe it. So we can only make deductions about how nature works currently and deduce from that how it might have been in the past, but we cannot reproduce any observances from there, at least not in that magnitude. Also, of course, history, the science of history, if you want to consider it as science, there you have the same problem in the theory of evolution. There is basically the same issue there. So there you cannot really reproduce these results, and therefore this condition cannot be completely fulfilled, although you consider such branches of science also to be science. But what you can see from there already is that results that you obtain in these theories are at least not this conclusive, or can, in my opinion, cannot be considered as conclusive as ones where you really have reproducible events, where you really could reproduce the results and really verify it this way, and therefore they are in some sense weaker, the results that you obtain this way. Okay, time for a short break. And as I do it usually in these breaks, I want to give you some insight into my latest novel, Alien Thoughts. So let's listen in. Outside, a fresh breeze blew in her face. After all the time spent in perfectly air-conditioned offices, this air was welcome to her, and she decided to walk the way to her apartment. She left the campus, walked past the bridge, and enjoyed the view of the Heidelberg Castle for a moment. It was particularly accentuated by the rays of the setting sun. Above the castle, on the Königstuhl, the radio towers could clearly be seen. These were already there before the new order was established. Since then, they served for the thought control of large parts of the Rhine-Neckar region. Spellbound by today's particularly beautiful view of the castle, Patricia overlooked a pedestrian who was coming towards her and bumped into him. She was startled when she saw his furious face and was frightened for a moment. Immediately his expression changed, and with a friendly smile he apologized and asked if everything was all right. She answered in the affirmative and continued walking across the Neckarwiese, the meadow at the riverbank. For this man, the situation must have been such that after she bumped into him, he got angry and wanted to yell at her. He came to reason and decided to remain friendly. In fact, however, this was mind control by the AIs in action. In a fraction of a second, the AIs had recognized the emerging thought of anger, and by deliberately playing in deceptively real alien thoughts, they convinced the man to remain friendly. Only when one knew about these mechanisms, as Patricia did, it became noticeable in everyday interactions with people. So in this short excerpt there is this mind control which this book is about, shortly described. So if you found this interesting and want to learn more about how this works, how this whole world works, what's happening there, what's the story behind it is, and what will happen in the end, then I encourage you to get the book. You can order it on Amazon as an ebook, and I really would enjoy it if you would read it and also give me some feedback on it and write a review. This just helps other readers to get to know the book and get to see if this would also be something for them to read. So this is how the scientific method works. So now let's look how it came about. So basically, as I already told you, Isaac Newton is one of the founders of the scientific method. Other who can be considered founders are, for example, Johannes Kepler and other scientists in this time. And the question is, how did he come to this? What was his mindset that he came to this conclusion that this might be a useful thing? Of course, it resulted organically. It was not only him who was working on it, but he was a huge part in it, and he was, I think, a crucial figure in the development of the scientific method, and therefore it's important to learn why that was, how he came to these conclusions. And Newton's teachers and mentors were mostly were people who were considering things like naturalistic theology, which is basically the idea that God not only reveals himself through scripture, but also in nature. So that was their conviction, and that was a rather new idea that came about in this time. So it was actually not new. It was basically like the Renaissance. Many things were reborn or discovered. But they were of this conviction, and Newton apparently shared this conviction, which you can directly see if you read his Principia Mathematica, where he always refers his scientific results to the God of the universe, and considers his scientific results to be, especially in his General Scholium, he considers them to be clear evidence that this can only have come about with a creator, with a designer. And therefore this was the basis of his work, of his scientific work, and therefore I think you can really argue that this worldview also had something to do with him developing the scientific method. And as I think also told in the English podcast several times, is that if you look at the scientific method, that the theories need to be falsified. There's also a Christian element in it if you look at it deeper, because it's the understanding that the human nature is in itself fallen and needs to be accounted for, that the mistakes humans make need to be accounted for, and that even if we have a mind that can deduce, as the ancient Greeks thought, that there still might be mistakes occurring that need to be accounted for. Otherwise, it may lead into errors, as some philosophies of the Greeks did. So therefore, this I think is also a sign that the scientific method is based on a Christian worldview, and that Newton, one of the founders of the scientific method, had a deeply Christian worldview is more evidence to that. So this resulted in the scientific revolution, as it's called today, and I think there's no doubt that this has changed the world as nothing or almost nothing else has. And there you can also see this in difference of technology. You can see, if you just look in the time span of technologies between the starting of this scientific revolution, let's say in the 1700s or in the 1600s, and then we look in the technologies we have today, and we compare this to the same time span in antiquity, then we will basically see that there's a huge difference. Just if you look at weapon technology, the weapon technology in ancient times basically remained pretty stable. They were fighting with swords basically all the time. I mean, they had some machines for sieges and so on, but there was not really that huge development in this time compared to the development, for example, in weapon technology that came from the 1600s to today. So there's a huge difference there, and this is due to the scientific revolution. This is due to industrialization, which is of course also a result of the scientific revolution, and this is a result of this development of the scientific method. So there was a huge effect this had on society, on the world, and also on the West, and therefore it is important to understand this, and also to understand the root for this, as I argue, coming from a Christian worldview. So now later, or if we also look into how we consider science today when we are regarding science, one is often talking about something like a methodological atheism, which is basically the idea that we will not consider God in questions regarding science, that we just will keep God out of it, basically. And the idea is that we say, okay, science deals with the materialistic world, not the spiritual world, and therefore we want to describe the materialistic world, and therefore we will keep everything that is spiritual, whether it exists or not, we will just keep it out of it. So it's not saying we assume that God doesn't exist because we don't believe it, and therefore we behave like atheists. The idea is rather to say that it's just better to work this way because we are dealing with the materialistic and not the spiritual. This might sound really reasonable, but I think in some way it leads into nothingness, basically. So I mean, it sounds reasonable as I explained, that we are dealing with the materialistic, but as we have seen, it is not really scientific. This worldview actually is not really scientific. To do it this way is not scientific, and it was developed much later, only during Darwin's time and so on. This was included in science and considered to be scientifically reasonable, but since the critique or from this side is often that if you just allow something like the idea that a God exists into science, then this will lead to theories of God of the gaps, and to just not proper science being properly, science not being efficient, or not being efficient anymore, because everywhere where some gaps occur, one just closes them by saying, yeah, there's a God behind it. But if one argues this, then one first has to explain how it can be that the scientist who was mostly in this way, who was studying scripture more than he was doing science, and who was really coming from this worldview, and in his scientific work really portraying this Christian worldview and relating it without making any without distinguishing between those two, how this scientist, Isaac Newton I'm speaking of, how he could be so efficient. I think you could argue that he was more efficient than any scientist has ever been, or at least among those who were the most efficient scientists. How could this be that he was so efficient if he did it wrongly, basically, if he did the thing that is criticized, and bringing his faith or his religious convictions into it, in a sense that he thinks God reveals himself in nature, and that he considers this to be the driving factor behind science, without, of course, I mean, you can see this at Newton, that he never did arguments like God of the gaps things. He really described nature in a scientific way, but behind it he always saw a creator who created it always with a purpose. So it doesn't really explain how it could be that many Christian scientists, also later, also after Newton, Johannes Kepler or Michael Faraday, many of really successful scientists, also James Clerk Maxwell, who is basically the founder of electromagnetism, how these people could come to these really efficient scientific breakthroughs if their faith would have been in the way of this. So this can just not be. And let's then look it in the other way. Maybe this methodological atheism is a hindrance to science. I mean, it could also be, right? Because if we just assume that there is a God, and that the questions that we in science at some point come to questions where we could not exclude God anymore because he does exist, then if we work according to such a methodological atheism, what would then happen? Of course, research would get stuck. We wouldn't be able to continue, because we would just exclude the one thing that would lead us further, that would lead us to the next breakthrough. And I think in some areas of science you can also see this happening, especially in design questions in biology, where the cells appear to really have been beautifully designed, where they act like machines, where you have basic analogies to robots and to computer science being taken in biology, oftentimes, especially in microbiology. So there you see that there apparently seems to be a design behind it, but the scientists there refuse to acknowledge this, or try to get away of this or get around this, and then terms like evolutionary design, which basically do not make any sense, come about. So this seems to be the case there. And also questioning regarding the beginning of the universe, of course, there also necessarily it is a question of belief, how you believe the universe came into being, and therefore this should play a role there, which way or ever. So I think there we come to problems, because we exclude the thing that might help us for the next breakthrough. And what I'm not arguing is that we need to drop methodological atheism completely, although I think it leads to nothing at some degree, but that's just my opinion. But that's not what I'm arguing for. But I think what we need to do is we need to allow both or several explanations and worldviews to come into our scientific endeavors, because and then let's have like a competition of those ideas, and the ideas that win seem to be the ones who are closer to the truth. For example, there are some cases where apparently intelligent design arguments have made better predictions than predictions from an evolutionary worldview or a worldview of atheism or methodological atheism. For example, Stephen Meyer says about there was this chunk DNA that was observed where it was from an evolutionary perspective. It was thought that this is just some chunk DNA, some chunk that's not useful, some relic of evolution that is not useful for anything. And of course, for somebody who is arguing from intelligent design, this does not make sense. So they argued, no, this cannot be, that has to be mostly useful for something. There has to be some use for it, and so on. And they were arguing this, and in the end, it turned out that this chunk DNA really has some use. It really has uses in nature and is being used, and therefore this intelligent design arguing, or the people arguing from intelligent design were closer to the truth or closer to the scientific facts than those who were arguing from a methodological atheism. So in a sense, this means that there are advantages to such a worldview, and I think even that in the end it would be completely superior to such a methodological worldview. But okay, that's my opinion. But even if you just look at it objectively, it would be reasonable to say, okay, let's have those ideas in competition, and those who work better in this way we will use there, those who work better in that way we will use there, and we will be completely, that would be the scientific ideal in some sense, to say we are completely objective which one we use. Of course, this is not possible, but if at least to try it this way, and then to have them compete against each other, and then one will see which will come through, which will be more successful. And I think from the one who's being more successful, one can also see which interpretation of nature is closer to the truth. So that's everything for today's episode. I hope you liked it and you enjoyed each part of it. If you want to get in touch with me or discuss a topic or want to give me some feedback, then feel free to contact me using the contact form on my website, sci-faith.de/en. And there you can go to the contact tab and contact me. And if you have any other things or episodes you want to have covered there, or topics you want to have covered, feel free to contact me there. Also, if you are not yet familiar with the format in which this podcast is produced, let me just briefly explain it to you. So there is always at the beginning of a month or of a block, there is a big block of 4 episodes in one thing. It's kind of like a preview, which I call it, where you have the next 4 episodes all in one episode together, combined. And this is for people who like to hear long format podcasts, who have a long way to work or something else, where they can listen to a long episode and can then have a preview of the next 4 episodes all at once, and are completely up to date from the beginning of the block. For those who like their episodes shorter, who prefer it if they have a half an hour or even less of a podcast episode, for those there is every week afterwards will appear a podcast episode almost in that length, and this way I can publish every week a new podcast every episode, and everyone can have it his own way, either once a month a long chunk of content, or once a week a shorter format podcast episode. So I think that's the best way for everyone, and also for me when I'm producing it. Please also note that this is an independent podcast, which means that it is recorded, produced, and marketed by me. So I really need your support in this. So if you like this podcast, then give it a 5-star rating. And if you have the time, even write a review to it. This just helps other listeners to become aware of this podcast, and then people who might be interested in this content can become aware of it. Also, if you have friends who you think would like this content, then recommend it to them and share it with them. Also, you can support me in other ways, for example, by reading my blog and subscribing to my newsletter, or even by reading my books, which you can find on Amazon. For example, there is my latest novel out now is Alien Thoughts, which is pretty entertaining from the feedback that I gotten, and so it's also in some way related to science and faith. The topic of it is also in there, but of course you can also read the book to this podcast, Sci-Faith, The Compatibility of Science and Faith, which is also available in English since last year. Thank you for that, and now I wish you a wonderful day, and I'm looking forward for you to tune in again next time.